You think you're safe once the doors are locked. You believe that deadbolt is the final word between your world and the one waiting outside. But the truth is, a lock is just a suggestion. And for some people, the real terror isn't about keeping someone out. It's the horrifying realization that someone is already in. Daylight gives us a false sense of security, a comforting blanket of routine and reason. It's only when the clock strikes 12, when the world grows quiet and the house settles into its own private darkness, that the real sounds begin to emerge. A tap on the window, a creak in the hall, the low hum of a garage door that should be still. Tonight, we're diving into 5 true Home Alone horror stories sent in by people who learned that the most frightening moments of their lives didn't just happen at night. They began and got terrifyingly worse after midnight. Story 1. The taps on the window. Our first story comes from a guy named Leo, who was 17 at the time. It was a golden opportunity. His parents were gone for the whole weekend, visiting family out of state. For a teenager, this was the jackpot. The second-floor apartment, his kingdom for 2 days, was in a quiet, unassuming complex. The weekend kicked off predictably. He had friends over Friday night. They ate pizza, played video games until their eyes were blurry, and filled the normally quiet apartment with noise and laughter. By Saturday evening, though, the novelty had worn off. His friends were gone. Leftover pizza boxes were piled in the corner, and a strange quiet had settled over the place. He wasn't lonely, not really. He was enjoying the freedom. He sprawled on the living room couch, binge-watching a show his parents would hate, with the volume turned up just because he could. The hours melted away. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. He made one last trip to the kitchen for a soda, making sure the front door was deadbolted, a habit his dad had drilled into him. The chain was on. He was secure. He headed back to his bedroom, the city lights painting soft, blurry patterns on his ceiling, and felt that comfortable weight of sleep pulling him down. The digital clock on his nightstand read 11:47 p.m. when he finally drifted off. He was deep asleep when some distant nagging sound managed to claw its way into his consciousness. He blinked his eyes open, totally disoriented. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of his alarm clock. 12:38 a.m. And then he heard it again. It was faint, rhythmic, and it was coming from his window. His bedroom was on the second floor. His first thought was a tree branch. The complex had several big oak trees that would sometimes scrape the building on windy nights. But tonight, the air was completely still. He listened. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. He told himself he'd imagined it, just a phantom sound from a dream. He rolled over, pulling the covers to his chin. This time, it was clearer, more deliberate. This wasn't the scraping of a branch. It was the sharp, distinct sound of a fingernail, or maybe a small rock being tapped against the glass on purpose. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He slowly sat up in bed, every muscle tensed. He strained his ears, listening for anything else. Footsteps on the gravel below, voices, a car. Nothing, just the crushing silence of the late night, broken by that impossible sound. Who would be tapping on his window? His room faced the back of the complex, which was just a small patch of grass and a line of tall hedges. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing to stand on. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The tapping stopped. Minutes stretched into what felt like an hour. Maybe it was an animal. A big bird. His rational mind was scrambling for an explanation, but his gut was screaming that something was deeply wrong. He thought about turning on the light, but a powerful primal fear kept him frozen. A light would only announce to whoever or whatever was out there that he was awake. The silence was broken again, but this time it was a single, louder thump against the glass, like something had bumped into it. That was it. Logic went out the window, replaced by pure, raw fear. He grabbed his phone, his hands trembling so violently he could barely unlock it. He didn't dare use the flashlight. He fumbled to dial 911, his thumb hovering over the call button. Was he overreacting? Calling the cops over a noise he'd feel like an idiot if it was just the wind. Louder now, insistent. It felt like a message. I'm here. I know you're in there. He pressed call. He whispered to the dispatcher, explaining the situation as quietly as he could, his voice cracking. Home alone. Someone tapping on his second-story window. The dispatcher was calm, professional. She told him officers were on their way and to stay on the line, but to keep quiet. The minutes he waited for the police were the longest of his life. The tapping had stopped again, and the silence that took its place was somehow more threatening. Was the person gone, or were they just waiting? Finally, he saw the blessed, silent sweep of headlights cut through a gap in his curtains. A car had pulled into the complex. Staying on the phone, he crept out of his bedroom and peered through the peephole of the front door. 2 officers. He quickly unlatched the deadbolt and chain and let them in, still whispering as he explained what he heard. One of the officers, an older, weary-looking man, nodded slowly. "All right, son, where's your room?" he asked. Leo led them down the short hall. The second officer was already clearing the other rooms. The older cop walked to the window Leo pointed at. "So, you heard a tapping on this window?" "Yes," Leo whispered. "It was consistent, like someone wanted my attention." The officer looked out into the dark, then looked back at Leo. He seemed to be thinking. Then he did something that made Leo's blood run cold. He raised his own hand and, with his knuckle, he gently tapped on the glass. It was the exact same sound, the exact same rhythm. "Like that?" the officer asked. Leo could only nod, his throat suddenly tight. The officer's radio crackled. He spoke into it, his voice low. Then he and his partner started a thorough search of the apartment. They checked closets, looked under Leo's bed, and cleared the living room and kitchen. Everything seemed normal. Leo was starting to feel that flush of embarrassment again. Did he really drag these men out here for a bad dream? The older officer then moved toward his parents' bedroom at the end of the hall. He pushed the door open into the dark room and clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting a clean path through the blackness. He swept it around the room dresser, closet, neatly made bed. As the beam traveled along the floor, it passed the edge of the bed. For a split second, the light caught something. The officer froze. He moved the beam back. There, crammed under his parents' queen-sized bed, was a man. He was tall, folded into the small space, his face smeared with dirt. He wore dark, ragged clothes, and his eyes were wide and wild in the sudden flashlight beam. He was perfectly still, like a cornered animal. The air left Leo's lungs. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. The man had been in the apartment the whole time. The entire time. When his friends were there, when he was watching TV on the couch, He had been lurking, somewhere in the shadows, just waiting. The tapping wasn't someone trying to get in. It was someone already inside, toying with him. Maybe to lure him to the window, maybe as a signal to someone else. He'd never know. The officers shouted commands and pulled the man out. He didn't fight. He was gaunt and silent, seeming totally disconnected from reality. As they cuffed him and led him away, he never once looked at Leo. The investigation found he was a transient with a history of mental illness and breaking and entering. He had likely slipped in through an unlocked patio door earlier in the day and had been hiding, waiting for the dead of night. Leo's parents came home the next day. They sold the apartment within 6 months. Leo could never sleep in that room again, couldn't even be in the apartment without feeling the phantom weight of that man's presence. He'll forever be haunted by that simple sound, that tap, 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 and the horrifying knowledge of how close he was to a danger that had been breathing the same air all along. Story 2, The Rage in the Attic. This next story is about what happens when your safe space gets violated and the terrifying sound of a hunt. It comes from a woman named Clara, who was house-sitting for a professor in a large, older home on the edge of town. The house was her dream, filled with books, old maps, and the kind of comfortable, academic clutter she found charming. The professor was away for 2 weeks, and Clara, a grad student, was thrilled to have this huge house all to herself. It was the perfect, quiet place to study. For the first week, it was paradise. She spent her days writing and her evenings reading in a plush armchair, the only sounds being the rustle of pages and the old house's gentle groans. She loved the building's character, its creaks and quirks. She felt completely safe. The night the terror began was a Wednesday. A storm had been brewing all day, and by midnight, a low rumbling thunder had started. Clara was in the second-floor master bedroom, propped up on a mountain of pillows, reading. The wind was picking up, rattling the window frames. It was cozy. The clock on her bedside table read 12:50 a.m. That's when she heard the first sound that didn't belong. It wasn't a creak. It wasn't the wind. It was a loud thump from downstairs. It sounded like a heavy book being dropped flat on the hardwood floor. Clara froze, her eyes lifting from the page. She listened. The only reply was the rumbling thunder. She told herself it was nothing. The house was over 100 years old. It made noises. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on her book, but her ears were now straining, listening for a follow-up. The follow-up came 5 minutes later, and it was far worse. It was the sound of footsteps. This wasn't some thief trying to be quiet. This was heavy, frantic, and angry. Someone was sprinting through the ground floor of the house. She could hear them move from the living room into the dining room, followed by a muffled crash, and then silence, a pregnant, terrible silence. Clara was no longer in a charming old house. She was in a trap. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was on the second floor. The only way out was down the main staircase, which she was certain was now being watched. Her phone was on the nightstand. She reached for it, her hands shaking. Before she could grab it, the footsteps started again. This time, they were on the stairs, heavy, booted, and coming up fast. There was no time to call for help, no time to think. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for an escape. There was none. Then she saw it. The closet. It was a deep walk-in, and on its ceiling, she remembered seeing a square outline, an access panel to the attic. It was her only chance. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet silent on the thick rug. She didn't dare turn on a light. She slipped into the closet, pulling the door almost shut behind her, and reached up. Her fingers found the edge of the panel. It was just a piece of painted drywall. She pushed. It lifted easily. With a surge of adrenaline, she hoisted herself up, hooking her arms over the edge of the opening. The air was thick with the smell of dust and ancient wood. She pulled herself into the blackness of the attic, her legs dangling for a moment before she found purchase on a crossbeam. She reached down and carefully, silently, pulled the attic panel back into place, plunging herself into absolute darkness. She wasn't a second too soon. The bedroom door burst open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Clara clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. Through the tiny gaps around the attic panel, she could see a slice of the room below. A man stood there. He was wearing dirty jeans and heavy work boots, breathing hard like an animal. He stomped around the room, his movements jerky and violent. He wasn't looking for valuables. He was looking for a person. He ripped the covers off the bed. He looked under it. A guttural sound of frustration escaped his lips. Then, in a fit of pure, terrifying rage, he grabbed the end of the mattress and flipped the entire thing over. The heavy mattress and box spring crashed against the headboard, and the man let out a hoarse, frustrated scream. The sound vibrated right through the floorboards, directly beneath where Clara was hiding. She was certain her own frantic heartbeat was loud enough for him to hear. He was so close. He kicked the overturned bed, then stormed out of the room. Clara heard him slam open the bathroom door, then the guest room. Each slam was a hammer blow to her nerves. She stayed perfectly still, crouched on the rough wooden beams in the pitch-black attic. She didn't know how long she stayed there. 10 minutes, an hour. She just listened to the man's angry rampage through the rest of the upstairs. Then, the noises moved downstairs again. More crashing, more rage. Finally, after an eternity, she heard the distant but unmistakable sound of sirens. The noises in the house stopped instantly. A moment later, she heard a back door slam shut, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She was paralyzed, convinced it was a trick, that he was waiting for her to come out. She stayed in that attic, listening to the police officers moving through the house below, their voices calm and authoritative. It wasn't until she heard one of them call out, "Clear," that she finally let herself sob silent, racking tears in the dusty darkness. Eventually, she worked up the courage to push open the panel and call out, her voice a weak croak. The officers helped her down. The house was a wreck. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were emptied, but almost nothing of value was taken. The only thing that truly told the story was the master bedroom. The flipped bed stood as a monument to the intruder's violent frustration. They never found him. Police guessed it was likely someone who thought the house was empty, or maybe someone with a personal vendetta against the professor. Clara left that night and never went back. For years, she couldn't sleep in a second-story room. She couldn't shake the feeling of being hunted, of the sheer animalistic rage of the man in the work boots. The memory of his scream and the crash of the bed just inches beneath her became a permanent scar. If these stories are making you double-check your own locks, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel and lets us know you want more true horror. Now, let's get back to the darkness. Story 3, The Creak in the Hallway. Sometimes most terrifying thing isn't what you see, but what you can't be sure you saw. Our third story comes from a young woman named Maya, and it proves that sometimes not knowing is the worst outcome of all. Maya was staying at her aunt's charming rustic house for the weekend. The one feature that always unsettled her, though, was that it backed directly onto a dense, dark stretch of woods, picturesque during the day. At night, a curtain of impenetrable blackness. Her aunt had been called away for a family emergency, and Maya offered to stay and look after the dog, a big, dopey golden retriever named Leo. On her first night alone, she did her usual routine, locked the doors, watched a movie, and let Leo out into the fenced backyard one last time. The air was cool and silent. The woods were just a solid wall of black. It was unnerving, but she shook it off. The fence was secure. She was safe. She went to bed around 11 p.m. with Leo sleeping on a dog bed on the floor next to her. She fell asleep easily, but woke up sometime later for no reason. There was no sound, just a sudden, sharp feeling of unease. She sat up, listening. The house was silent. Leo was still asleep, breathing softly. She glanced at her phone. 1:15 a.m. She decided to get a glass of water, hoping to shake the creepy feeling. The master bedroom was at one end of a long hallway. As she walked down it, she passed a spare bedroom with the door open. And for some reason, a reason she'll never be able to explain, she glanced inside, and her blood froze. For a split second, in the window of that spare room, she saw a shape. It was the distinct silhouette of a person's head and shoulders standing just on the other side of the glass. A dark shape against the slightly less dark night. She gasped and instinctively ducked back into the hall, pressing herself flat against the wall, her heart going into overdrive. It was a trick of the light, a reflection. It had to be. The window faced the fenced-in backyard. Someone would have had to climb the fence, but the image was burned into her mind. It was too clear, too defined. After a moment of panicked hesitation, she forced herself to look again. She peered around the doorframe. Nothing there, just the dark glass and the blackness of the woods beyond. The relief she expected to feel never came. Instead, a new, more sinister fear crept in. Was she losing her mind? Had she really seen it? The uncertainty was agonizing. She backed away from the room, grabbing her phone. She couldn't take the risk. She dialed 911, her voice a high, thin whisper, and told the dispatcher she thought she saw someone in her backyard. The dispatcher was reassuring, told her officers would be there shortly, and that she should find a safe place to wait or leave the house if she could. Maya ended the call, knowing she couldn't stay inside. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She grabbed her car keys from a hook by the door. She was about to make a run for the garage when Leo, the dog, suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the hallway, right outside the bedroom door, and then she heard it. It wasn't a loud sound. It was quiet, intimate. It was a single, slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard in the middle of the hallway. The hallway she had just walked down. The hallway that was supposed to be empty. That sound cut through her in a way no scream ever could. It was the sound of quiet, patient weight settling on an old piece of wood. It was the sound of someone moving slowly, trying not to be heard. The silhouette she saw wasn't just someone in the yard. They had gotten in, and they were in the house with her. The creak confirmed it. It was real. She didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat. She didn't wait for a second creak. In that one crystallizing moment of terror, she turned and fled, not to the garage. She ran to the back door, fumbled with the lock, and burst out into the chilly night. She sprinted across the lawn, vaulted over a low section of fence, and ran into the tree line, hiding behind a thick oak tree, her body trembling uncontrollably. From her hiding spot, she could see the back of the house. No lights were on. Nothing moved. It was a perfect, still portrait of a peaceful home. But she knew better. A few minutes later, the flashing lights of 2 police cars painted the front of the house in red and blue. She watched as officers approached with guns drawn, surrounded the house, and then went inside. She just saw their flashlights cutting through the darkness of the spare bedroom window. She waited for them to drag someone out, but they never did. After 20 minutes, the officers emerged, and one of them shook his head while talking on his radio. Maya didn't come out of the woods. She couldn't. She watched as the police cars eventually drove away. The house was silent and dark again, but it was no longer a home. It was a tomb of a memory. She called a friend, who came and got her. The police report said there was no sign of forced entry, and no one was found. It was logged as a possible false alarm. But Maya knows what she saw. And more importantly, she knows what she heard. The image of the silhouette is frightening, but it's the memory of that single, soft creak in the hallway that truly haunts her. It was the sound of her paranoia being proven right. The sound of a monster confirming its own existence. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Story 4. The siege at the Airbnb. We trust strangers all the time, right? We get into cars with drivers we've never met and sleep in homes owned by people we only know through a screen. This next story is about what happens when that trust is shattered. It comes from a guy named Ben, who learned that sometimes you're not the one being targeted, you're just in the way. Ben was a consultant whose job had him traveling constantly. He'd gotten tired of sterile hotel rooms and started using Airbnb for a more personal, comfortable feel. On this trip, he rented a small, modern guest house, detached from the main property and set back in a nicely landscaped, but kind of isolated backyard. The listing had glowing reviews, and the host seemed perfectly friendly online. The first 2 days were great. The place was clean, quiet, and private. On the 3rd night, he was exhausted after a long dinner with clients. He got back to the Airbnb around 11:30 p.m., locked the door, and fell into a deep sleep. He was ripped from that sleep by a feeling, not a sound, a primal sense of being watched. His eyes opened to the dim room, and he instinctively looked towards the large window that faced the backyard, and his heart stopped. There was a face in the window, a man. His features, blurry in the dark, was peering inside, his hands cupped around his eyes. Ben didn't even have time to be scared. He just reacted. He rolled off the side of the bed, landing silently on the floor, his body drenched in cold sweat. He was completely exposed. He crawled on his hands and knees toward his phone, which was charging on a desk across the room. As he crawled, he heard a low whisper from outside. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was conversational. The man wasn't alone. Ben snatched his phone and scrambled into the small bathroom, quietly clicking the lock. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely type his passcode. As he dialed 911, a new sound began. Footsteps, but not just one person. It was a soft shuffling on the gravel path that surrounded the guest house. It sounded like a dozen people, A quiet, organized army was assembling right outside his door. Then, the rattling started, gentle at first, a metallic jiggle at the front door lock, then a soft scraping at the window latch. It was coming from everywhere at once. It was a coordinated, systematic assault. They were patiently testing every point of entry, looking for a weak spot. Ben was huddled on the cold bathroom floor, whispering his location to the 911 dispatcher. The guest house, which had felt so private, now felt like a fragile glass box. The rattling grew more insistent, more violent. The gentle jiggling turned into forceful shaking. Hands were now banging on the window, the glass vibrating. The front door knob was being turned back and forth so hard he could hear the internal mechanism groaning. They weren't just trying to get in anymore. They were trying to break in. The sheer number of them was the most terrifying part. This wasn't a random burglary. This was targeted. Ben was sure that at any second, the window would shatter or the door frame would splinter. He could picture a crowd of faceless men pouring into the small space. There was nowhere to run. He pressed himself into the corner, making himself as small as possible. His mind blank, with a terror so profound, it felt like a physical weight. Then, through the chaos of banging and rattling, a new sound emerged, a high-pitched wail in the distance, a siren. It grew louder and louder. The effect was instantaneous. The banging stopped. The rattling stopped. The entire assault ceased, as if a switch had been flipped. Ben heard a flurry of footsteps on the gravel, moving quickly away. And then, silence. An absolute, deafening silence. When the police arrived, they found no one. The backyard was empty. There were fresh scuff marks on the doors and smudges on the windows, but no real damage. The officers were perplexed. They contacted the Airbnb host, who seemed surprisingly calm. His theory chilled Ben to the bone. The previous renters, who had checked out the day Ben arrived, had apparently been involved in some shady business. The host figured this group wasn't there for Ben at all. They were there for the last tenants and didn't know they were already gone. Ben was just a guy in the wrong house at the wrong time, collateral damage in a conflict he knew nothing about. He packed his bags in the middle of the night, his hands still trembling, and spent the rest of his trip in a brightly lit, anonymous high-rise hotel. He never used an Airbnb again. He couldn't shake the memory of that silent, coordinated pack of predators circling his little glass box, and the terrifying, random chance that put him in their path. Story 5, The Hum in the Garage. Our final story is a brutal reminder that modern conveniences can be turned against us, and that a locked door is no defense against an enemy who already has the key. This happened to a man named Mark, who lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone felt safe. His house was his fortress. He had a state-of-the-art security system, heavy-duty locks, and a solid steel garage door. Every night before bed, he'd walk the perimeter of his house, checking every lock, making sure his sanctuary was sealed. One Tuesday night, Mark was up late, working in his home office. It was well past 1:00 a.m. The house was dead quiet, all doors locked, security system armed. His car and its garage door opener was safely inside the locked garage. He was in his own secure little bubble. That's when he felt it more than heard it, a low, deep vibration that hummed through the floorboards. It was a familiar sound, but one he absolutely should not have been hearing. It was the unmistakable groan of his garage door rolling open. Mark froze, his finger hovering over his keyboard. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. It was impossible. His car keys, with the opener, were on the kitchen counter, 50 feet away. The only other way to open that door was the button on the wall inside the garage, which was itself behind a locked door. A malfunction, it had to be. He stood up, his heart picking up speed. He tiptoed out of his office and into the hallway, straining to hear. The hum had stopped. The house was silent again, but the silence felt different now, violated. He crept towards the kitchen, his eyes fixed on the door leading to the garage. It was closed and locked, just as he'd left it. But he knew the main garage door, the one to the outside world, was now wide open. He was about to disarm the security system to go look when he heard another sound. So faint, he almost missed it. Voices, muffled whispers, and they weren't coming from the garage. They were coming from upstairs. This was the moment that broke reality for him. It defied all logic. How could someone have opened the garage, entered the house, and gotten upstairs, all without tripping the motion detectors or making a single sound? On the main floor, his mind reeled. Had they been in the house all along, hiding? A cold, primal fear washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by adrenaline. This was his home, his fortress, and it had been breached. His eyes scanned the living room and landed on a heavy iron fireplace poker. He grabbed it, its weight feeling solid and reassuring in his trembling hand. He wasn't going to cower. He had to know who was in his house. He moved to the bottom of the main staircase, each step a calculated, silent movement. He could still hear them. The whispers were coming from the master bedroom, his bedroom. It sounded like 2, maybe 3 people, speaking in low, urgent tones. He took a deep breath and began to climb, one agonizing step at a time, the iron poker held out in front of him. He reached the top of the stairs. The hallway was dark. The door to his bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of light from a phone screen maybe, leaking from inside. He took one more step, preparing to confront them, to scream, to fight. That was his last conscious thought. As he moved past the doorway, 2 figures lunged out of the darkness. He had a split-second impression of 2 men in dark hoodies. Before he could even raise the poker, one of them swung something hard, a flash of blinding. White-hot pain erupted at the side of his head. The world tilted violently, and he collapsed, the fireplace poker clattering uselessly on the floor. His last sensation was the cold, hard wood of the landing against his cheek before everything went black. He woke up to chaos. The blurry faces of paramedics leaned over him. Cops were moving through his house. The side of his head throbbed with an unbearable pain. They had knocked him out with a baseball bat. The story came together in pieces. A neighbor, an insomniac, had been awake and heard the garage door open. A few minutes later, he heard the loud crash, the sound of Mark hitting the floor, and called the police. The approaching sirens had scared them off. They had fled out the back, leaving a mess behind, but not taking much. The investigation revealed the most chilling part. There was no malfunction. Modern garage door openers, especially older models, are vulnerable to code-grabbing devices. Thieves can use a simple electronic tool to capture the radio frequency code when you use your opener. They clone it, and then they can come back later, anytime they want, and open your garage door as if they have your own key. They had likely captured his code days or weeks earlier. They waited for the perfect moment, late at night, when he'd be asleep. They opened his garage, used a glass cutter to silently remove a small pane from the door leading into the house, unlocked it, and crept upstairs, bypassing the main floor motion sensors entirely. They were professionals. Mark recovered physically, but the psychological wound is still there. His fortress was an illusion. His high-tech security was defeated by a cheap gadget and a patient predator. He's haunted not by the attack itself, but by the quiet, calculated intelligence of it. The memory of that low, impossible hum in the dead of night is a constant reminder that the walls we build to keep the world out are sometimes just a doorway for the monsters to come in. The doors were locked. The house was quiet. They all thought they were safe. From a strange tap on a second-story window to the hum of a garage door that should have been silent. These stories prove that the most terrifying monsters are real, and they know how to wait. They wait for the sun to go down, for the world to fall asleep, and for the clock to tick past midnight, when the darkness is deepest and your screams are least likely to be heard. So, the next time you're sitting in your own home, listening to the quiet, are you really alone, or are you just the only one who doesn't know you have company? Which of these stories is going to be keeping you up tonight? Let me know in the comments below. And for more true horror stories that explore the darkness lurking just beneath the surface of our everyday lives, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Sleep tight